Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. Got a great stream for you with a great guest, Charles Haywood. Thanks for joining me, man.
Pleased to be here.
So Charles does a lot of very interesting stuff. He's got a great site. He does book reviews and he writes articles. Makes a lot of different appearances everywhere. You can check out all those links below. But for people who aren't familiar, could you explain my audience a little bit what you do?
What the main thing I do is I write my own opinions under the guise of book reviews through my main site, which is the Worthy House. And when I say I write my own opinions, that means in essence I both write original articles and I also do a lot of book reviews, which is how I got started. With the aim of the book reviews, both being to talk about the book. I mean, I'm not a complete bait and switch artist. I do talk about the books that I purport to review, but in large part, especially as it's developed over time, the book reviews are a vehicle for my own thoughts, an attempt to create a interlocking web of thoughts using the vehicle of different books in order to accomplish that. In essence, creating an overarching political philosophy.
Yeah, I've noticed that, and I like a lot of what you have to say over there. So I'm glad you're doing it in that way. It's an interesting way to kind of put it all together. Uh, I wanted to talk to you specifically over a topic that you address pretty regularly in a way that a lot of people don't, which is kind of the state of the current regime, what would come, that would disrupt it, and then what would come after. But before we get to that, you were just recently on Tucker Carlson, am I right?
That's correct.
I didn't get to see that yet. How did that go? Is that exciting?
Oh, it went great. I don't actually watch a lot of TV news, so I of course I'm aware of Tucker Carlson and I watch him occasionally, and I'm obviously a big fan of Tucker Carlson. But it was interesting because I wasn't one of those people who really knew what it was going to be like. The most interesting thing, I mean, it's a friendly discussion, so you get what you expect, which is a bunch of discussion where I get to talk about myself, which is, as I said on that program as well, is my favorite topic. So it wasn't adversarial in any way. But the interesting thing to me was that Carlson's personality in real life, talking off camera, is essentially identical to the personality you see on the television. There's no gap there. I think he just acts like himself all the time. So if there was something interesting that came out of it for me, other than obviously it was fun and a big deal to get that level of exposure, it's that his personality was pretty much exactly what you see on TV. A bit more swearing, but other than that, just the same.
Yeah, no, that's always nice to hear that you kind of get the same person. I'm surprised how often that happens. There are some people who turn it off and on, but that is always nice when you run into that. So the thing I wanted to talk to you about, like I said, is of course how often you address the state of the regime and what comes next. And one thing that I used to get a lot of flack for all the time was you're always talking about like the possibility of change and collapse, and no, the system will perpetuate forever, and these people have total power, total control, and it's a fantasy that any of this could ever come apart. I don't hear that very much anymore, and this is that's interesting that died down quite a bit. I don't get called that so often. So this is also something that you talk about, but what's interesting is people tend to call me a doomer about it. You tend to call yourself an optimist over it. Can you explain a little bit about kind of the state we're in and why you're optimistic?
Of course, and kind of a very short form version. It is interesting, by the way, before I get started, that the ground has shifted in the way you describe. I hadn't really noticed that or adverted to that personally, that you get a lot fewer of these things now than you used to about people claiming the regime will last forever. That kind of theme seems to have died down somewhat, I think, for obvious reasons. But I mean, I'm optimistic in the sense that I think the future can be extremely bright, because I think that America, or what I sometimes call, with respect to the future, the lands that once were America, still has an extremely large amount of things going for it. It's simply a question of reordering both the regime and the society in a way that allows us to get back to a path of human flourishing. To get to that, of course, we have to go through a fracture. And a fracture is the term I use more frequently and I think more consistently than collapse. Collapse gives you the fallout feeling, right? We're all going to be out there collecting bottle caps, as my daughter says, and trading them to each other. Now, I mean, I don't think there's never been a collapse in a Western society for more than a couple of hours. So, but you do have to have some kind of fracture, a reworking of the governmental system as well as the societal systems. And on the other end, though, there's no reason to imagine that America, or what will be America in the future, can't be completely awesome. And so I think that the people who are depressed about the regime maintaining its hold forever are wrong. And I think the people who are depressed because they think there's no alternative, even if the regime were to collapse, we're all going to sit around acting in unpleasant ways toward each other and grilling rats over open trash fires and things like that. I mean, those things are all just grossly unrealistic, just simply from a historical basis. And if you look at the strengths that America and Americans have, a lot of challenges to be sure too, but a lot of strengths, you can totally make this work. We can totally make this work.
So one thing that I think is really interesting is a lot of people like to talk about the problems that the regime has. We have a lot of people who are kind of cast off from the left, or have been, wouldn't otherwise kind of be part of the ruling coalition, and they like to flirt with kind of the chuds, right? They like to tell them how they can kind of take power or what they can do. Guys like Curtis Yarvin or Malcolm Kuhns, guys who I like,
Mhm.
I'm not kind of dunking on them here or anything. But one thing I've noticed is that as this becomes closer to reality, they seem to get more and more uncomfortable with the idea that change could actually come, and we start to get kind of this dialing it back. Whoa, wait, hold on. Are you sure you want to take these steps? It feels like a lot of people who saw the problems and maybe even were involved in kind of getting the right to kind of see things in this framework are now that the kind of the edge of the of the cliff is
Yeah.
rushing a little faster, seem to be trying to dial that back. We saw this with Yarvin's essay of the dark elves and everything, the famous
Sure.
thing. What do you think about that phenomenon with these people who feel like they wanted to kind of be on this team, but all of a sudden once this becomes reality, it's no longer fun and games. Maybe it's a little too.
That's an excellent question. I would, just as a sidebar, draw a pretty sharp distinction between Yarvin on the one hand and Malcolm Shiuni on the other side. I mean, Shiuni, I think, has his finger on the actual Chud pulse and the interest of the Chuds in mind from his perch in Sweden much more than Yarvin would. I mean, all you need to know with respect to Yarvin is that he chose to move back to California. So yeah, that kind of fits in with that question. But the answer, I think the answer is quite simple, which is, we're kind of eggheads, right? And the future belongs not to the eggheads, but to the doers. I believe it was Plato who famously went to the tyrant of Syracuse, Hiero, I think it was, and to persuade him how he could rule like a philosopher king. And he barely escaped with his life because men with actual power aren't real interested in being lectured to by philosophers. And this is a hopefully lesser version of the same thing. These people who have, I mean, there's a lot of people who are friends of ours who have done great work who will really have no relevance for the future. Yarvin may in fact have relevance for the future because he's a smart guy and he has a lot of interesting things to say. But philosophers always overstate their own relevance beyond the initial phases of any political movement. And we've been conditioned, I think, both by philosophers selling themselves and by certain happenstance events in the French Revolution and tied to the Enlightenment, in thinking that people who are ideas men are more important to the actual future than they really are. So it's not surprising that those people are kind of, a fracture is extremely bad for a lot of people. Even if you don't die, your life is discombobulated. And the old joke that most people think that a revolution is where they stand still while everything resets around them. In reality, as things get closer and people see that the regime actually is starting to crumble, people who have been calling for this for a while are like, well, I like my Starbucks lattes with caramel or whatever the hell people put in Starbucks lattes. And I like my life and I like my trips and I like the fact that, I mean, chaos fracture is very uncomfortable, very dangerous. So at some point, and it's dangerous when you're in the middle of it, and in the ramp up, it's particularly dangerous, particularly if you've chosen to identify yourself as someone who's an enemy of the regime. So you can
Yeah.
see why people may want to start dialing it back because it's there's some metaphor I'm searching for with respect to children. But you touch the stove often enough, I guess maybe you back off on it. That's not the right metaphor, but you get the idea that people
Right.
sense that there's actual risk here. It's no longer a game. We're playing with real knives rather than butter knives. So it's no wonder that people back off of it.
Yeah, I think that's true, and a lot of I also heard you did a review on Nima Parvini's elite book on elite theory,
Populist.
the populist illusion, which I thought was very good, and I do want to get into pieces of that kind of here later. But one thing, another group you kind of talked about briefly, and that was kind of the Scott Greer's, like everyone has to continue to go to college. Basically, like things are never going to change. Like the form is always going to remain the same, and so you kind of have to continue to follow those paths, even if you saying you want to change it fundamentally. You just can't imagine a world in which basically like the professional managerial class is not in power, and so you just continue to follow those paths even though you theoretically are opposed to it. And I think that that's true. Like there's, you know, like you said, the life of the mind, people want to hold symposiums. That's not super handy at a time when things get thrown into turmoil. And so people who've acquired a lot of following and interest, and of course, like you said, we're these people, we're people who benefit, of course, from this. We're sitting here talking about books, philosophy, and stuff. So it's to also admit our own, lack of maybe relevance in some of those events when they come. But that is a very undisquieting notion, I think, for a lot of people who aren't. If you're just disagreeing to be fashionable or to have a position or a voice rather than actually seeking change, that can be a very threatening thing once it actually kind of arrives. That kind of puts you in a.
And inertia is very powerful. I mean, and people who are focused on college, for example, inertia is very powerful, and pushing back against inertia, changing your momentum, has real costs. Especially if you're, for example, if you have a child and you say, well, should my child go to college or not? Well, if he doesn't go to college and doesn't have a clear other path, at a minimum, you're probably going to likely to suffer some loss of social prestige. And we all know a lot of parents live their lives through their children, whether that's sports or their accomplishments and so on. So it's a very powerful human emotion or element of human nature. Inertia, I understand it, but objectively, it's bad.
So one of the things, like I said, you address quite a bit is why the regime is coming apart, how it comes apart. And you even have a very interesting article about what Caesar would look like when it comes. Obviously, you have a whole article, so I'm not going to ask you to rehash it. But if you could just give a quick explanation, what do you see? Where are the? Obviously, there are many things that are show us that the regime is unstable. But what do you think are some of the key fault lines, and why do you think a Caesar-like figure would be able to kind of pick that up and make big changes? Where would that emerge, and how?
Mm-hmm. I think that the fault lines, of course, the actual fault line that would be the inception of a fracture is impossible to predict directly. And I think that there's symptoms which are not fault lines. For example, the transgender craziness and all sorts of other things that are frequently talked about on the right, on Twitter, what have you, are clearly indications of regime insanity and therefore regime instability. But those things aren't necessarily fractures, because as long as people are able to put bread on the table and heat their houses and so on, again, because of inertia, people will put up with a lot of those things. They shouldn't put up with them, but they do put up with them because that's human nature. So almost certainly, barring things like asteroid strikes and alien invasions, the actual inception point of any regime, any fracture that leads to regime crumbling, is going to be economic in nature. Because at the end of the day, people will only do things against the regime in any wide area or on a wide front, if they can thereby change their situation for the better. And it has to be bad enough that they want to do that, take the risks that are involved in that kind of thing. So, historically, you see this most commonly, actually, and you see this, and Malcolm Shiuni actually talks about this frequently. You saw this in the 1919 February Revolution in Russia, as well as in the French Revolution. Mothers of hungry children taking to the streets in a fairly violent way because their children are hungry. And so when you see something like that, not just the mothers taking action, but people actually being hungry in America or being unable to heat their houses, the kind of things that you might see in Europe this winter, at least the latter. That's when I think the real symptoms are going to arise for a regime fracture. But I think because of regime fragility, and this is not dissimilar in some ways to what happened in 1989 Eastern Europe, but because of regime fragility and technology, it'll happen a lot faster than I think most people think. This isn't going to be a slow motion kind of thing. There's so much stupidity, so much inanity in the economy. I think at least half of our economy is completely fake. That is, GDP is completely fake. Once it's like any preference cascade, or when the ball gets rolling, things will happen very quickly.
Now, obviously, we've seen things analogous to this, especially with the USSR and such. But it feels like in this case there isn't really a global hegemon to kind of keep the thing turning. So if America kind of comes apart in this way, what does that look like? Kind of pulled back, like do other countries come to the forefront? Does everybody kind of hit pause to see what happens with America? Do people make aggressive moves? Like what does that look like when you don't have another obvious candidate to kind of pick up and take that role of kind of world police there?
Well, you heard it here first. The Chinese take Hawaii, so no more sweet Hawaiian vacations. Or maybe you do. I mean, there's a Chinese hegemony. So
Use the
Chinese
same new passport, yeah.
Well, if you can get a visa, I'm sure they'll love to have big spenders in Hawaii. So I think that it looks like the reason I'm hesitating is because these things are very hard to predict. But I think that
Sure.
From an external perspective, it seems, as with any war, and you see this with the United States' proxy war in Ukraine, external powers get involved. But your point about the global hegemon is very important, because, and Michael Anton has made this point when people say that Brazil is America's future, that Brazil only works as Brazil because there's a Western Hemisphere hegemon, namely us. Right. The United States can't be Brazil. It also can't be Brazil for a variety of other reasons, but that's the primary reason. So what it almost certainly means like it is fracture along geographic and ethnic cultural lines. I mean, you go back to as political lines as well. I mean, I'm not one. You read the Kurt Schlichter books about a split between Blue America and Red America, and I think they're interesting books and funny in many ways. So he started writing them 10 years ago, and now they just seem prescient. But I don't think you could imagine like California and New York and those places being run as a separate country for a while. That would only work if they were propped up externally. For example, if the Chinese, if I could see California easily becoming a Chinese satrapy, and most of the West Coast becoming a Chinese satrapy, and the core of the country organizing probably under some kind of authoritarian Red Caesar type of regime, another Anton coinage, Red Caesar, Blue Caesar, which you touched on earlier. I didn't come back to it, and we can certainly continue on if you're interested. But I would imagine some fracturing into a new set of countries with some interference from the outside. But at the end of the day, if the United States disappears as a hegemon, the only people left as possible hegemons are the Russians and the Chinese, and neither of them has the Chinese have limited interest. The Russians have will probably take Alaska, I guess. But I think I would see America mostly, or what used to be America, mostly being left to its own devices. And hopefully that would be a relatively peaceful division into a set of successor states.
So this one will be probably a little obvious for some people, but I just want you to lay it out for some people who may not be familiar. Why Caesarism? Why is that the likely outcome? What is it about the dynamic of how things would come apart where that would be kind of the solution? Why wouldn't we just have a new constitution or something?
I divide the possibilities of the future into renewal, which would be a new constitution or going back to the old constitution, coup, and Caesar. So a coup is where you simply change the people who are in charge of the existing systems of government. And that doesn't seem likely in this case, because a coup typically requires an existing counter elite, which we don't really have in any meaningful way. You could imagine in theory a military coup in America, but it's not clear how that would work with the rottenness in the military ranks. So Caesar, defined generally as an authoritarian reconstructor of a country's institutions or of a nation's institutions, simply is historically the most likely thing that comes out of a fracture. It doesn't have to be that way. There have been other things that have worked in the past. The American founding is an example of that, but that wasn't a fracture at all, much less a fracture of the magnitude that we're talking about. So in order efficiency kind of dictates an authoritarian, and human nature dictates an authoritarian. That is, people. This is the Gordian knot solution, the old legend that when he was a teenager, Alexander the Great came across a knot that tied a cart to another cart or something like that, which was supposedly impossible to untie, and he simply cut it with his sword. So cutting it, thereby untying it, not really in the manner desired. And there was some prophecy that whoever did that would rule the world. And these things are of course made up after the fact to look good, but nonetheless, it's an interesting story. So a Caesar is a Gordian knot solution, someone who can remake a society when either it's completely fractured, so someone has to rebuild the pieces, or can modify an existing system by sweeping the unnecessary, unneeded, or bad elements away quickly without the hassle of going through the traditional procedures. I mean, this is a Carl Schmitt kind of thing, the sovereign dictator who can rebuild the institutions of a country. So there's many kind of nuances within that and possible ways that could go. I'm not saying a red Caesar is a good Caesar or a bad Caesar. There are plenty of both good Caesars and bad Caesars. The one thing I will say is I don't think there's any chance whatsoever of a blue Caesar that is a left-wing Caesar. I saw someone maintaining the other day that Gavin Newsom could be blue Caesar. I think, aside from the fact that Gavin Newsom does not have the adequate charisma, the modern left simply is unable to tolerate a Caesar because in its nature, it seeks emancipation and equality. And no Caesar can rule while both emancipating and pushing equality. So it's impossible to have an ideologically left Caesar.
Well, one thing you talked about, and I guess this would be going to the cutting of the Gordian knot, was the fact that the new Caesar would kind of be escaping ideology, right? Wouldn't hold a particular ideology or another. And I think that's kind of key because we're in this mode where I think pretty much all of our politics is captured kind of by the competing ideologies and the war between them. And so many people are trapped in thinking about what could be good for the country because the most important thing is that their ideology wins. And I think that the fact that the Caesar would break through that would be really important. Could you talk a little bit about ideological capture and how Caesar would be making decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the ideology is the age of political ideology is hopefully coming to an end, in the sense that the only ideology in the pre-Enlightenment era was religious ideology. And so most people had lived their lives, however, with no reference whatsoever to how they were governed, the politics of the state, or anything like that. It's a modern conceit that everyone has to have an ideology, everyone has to be involved in politics. It's a modern, very bad conceit. And of course, embedded within or tied to that is the idea that everyone should be participating in government, that in a democracy, everyone has an actual say in government, and all these other kind of myths. I mean, that kind of goes far afield and touches back on some of the stuff that Parvini discussed in the populist delusion, that people have this delusion that they have a role in government, but they don't. So they have the worst of all possible worlds. They don't actually have any power, but they spend all their time being fiercely ideologized and thereby corroding society. So I think that a Caesar, by definition, a red Caesar, that is an authoritarian rightist, is by definition going to be somewhat right-wing, in the sense that reality is inherently right-wing. And so when you recognize the reality of differences among people, or you don't recognize certain fantasies that the left likes to push, that kind of makes you right-wing, but it's not an ideology. It's simply a recognition of reality and governing in a way that reflects reality. And that's what all people who used to seize power and want to exercise power used to do. They didn't have an ideology until the relatively modern era. They simply governed in a way that they thought was both good for themselves, and if you have a good authoritarian, good for the broader society. That you can't guarantee that you'll have those two things together, but ideally you have an authoritarian like the ideal of medieval kingship is someone who cares, who is focused on the souls and the well-being of the people, and obviously benefits himself at the same time. That's kind of the nature of the beast. But therefore, a Red Caesar, a successful Red Caesar, is not going to have an ideology. It's also true that there's no, other than kind of things which had limited traction in the early mid 20th century, there really aren't any right ideologies. I mean, the Cato Institute may have a libertarian ideology, but it's not an ideology in the same all-encompassing way that the left has an ideology. So just in the nature of it, if you're Donald Trump, I'm leaving aside Trump's other debilities, Trump doesn't have an ideology. I mean, everything is pretty incoherent with Trump, obviously, but he doesn't have an ideology. So if somehow MAGA became the rulers of the country, it wouldn't be ideological. I don't think it would be good necessarily in terms of competence, but it wouldn't be ideological at all. It's just inherent in the nature of the left crumbling and losing all power forever, which is absolutely required for anything to work in the future. We're not going to have an ideologized society. Most people, frankly, should have nothing whatsoever to say about politics except on the local level. And I think a Red Caesar would both encourage and demand that, because there's no real benefit to an authoritarian to have the people think that they get a say.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think you needed, of course, that investment and that expansion and that education of ideology so that you can kind of sell the popular sovereignty thing, right? You need people to think that the ideas that are being pushed are theirs and that these are the values they hold, so that you can then advance them in their name. Now, one thing I'm interested in is you talked about the need for the likelihood that Caesar will probably centralize power. Now, I think that's of course true, right? That's a relatively safe bet on your part. One thing that I am concerned about, of course, is the continuation of a managerial elite beyond this. I think our modern society, in many ways, requires it, right? Or at least it believes it requires it for its function. And if you're gonna have a Caesar who is also built into that, I guess the question I'm asking is there a scenario in which power can be devolved, that a regionalism or a nationalism can be devolved, or is it kind of just going to be a continued centralization of power, Caesar or not, going forward? Is there any way for this to break apart in a way that doesn't continually kind of push all power invested under one organization?
Sure. Burnham, James Burnham, who wrote The Managerial Revolution, which I know you have had many comments on, is he got it wrong in the sense that he thought managerialism was going to be competent, and it's turned out to be massively incompetent. I think that's kind of the key to analyzing this question. Because when I say Caesar is going to centralize things, the risk with Caesar is that Caesar will take the tools that the modern state has built and use them to safeguard and enhance his power, because the temptation is entirely too great. So that's a problem, and it relates to the succession problem. That is, and this is always the Achilles heel of Caesars, which is, once you're Caesar, how do you establish a new system that works for the future, that doesn't just lead to chaos every time the guy in charge dies or gets bumped off? But that's actually a somewhat different question. If you're Caesar, you'll also have a lot of decentralization. I mean, let's imagine you have Red Caesar who takes over the entire current United States. Not unlikely, but okay, fine. 90% of the federal bureaucracies have no use whatsoever to that man. They all should just be fired instantly, because they don't produce any power benefit to him. But there are various elements of patronage and graft and positions for elite overproduction. Those people don't benefit Caesar at all. They're just the people who regulate, do all the environmental regulations preventing farmers in Wyoming from modifying their ponds. There's no benefit to Red Caesar. All those people just get fired instantly and kicked out. I mean, Washington, D.C. is turned into a ghost town except for its national security apparatus. I mean, the goal of Caesar is to have a government of unlimited means to limited ends. Those limited ends being national security, broadly speaking, national flourishing, and of course, the continued power and life of Caesar. That's the way these things work. So I think you could have a huge amount of decentralization while still having a very strong central government, because the way our government has accreted, as you say, because of the worship of managerialism, is this bizarre system of parasites at every level of both government and society. I mean, we talk about government, but an even bigger problem is NGOs and various kind of so-called nonprofits. I mean, if I'm Red Caesar, literally, well, I always say literally the first thing I do, and that's actually like 100 things. So something actually has to be the first thing. But among the very first things I would do is I would confiscate every cent of every foundation, entity, whatever that has involved itself in a significant degree in any left-wing operations or propaganda. So I'd take all of George Soros's money. I'd take all of the Ford Foundation's money. I'd fire all those people. I'd confiscate all their assets except for maybe $50,000. I mean, this it's a form of prescription. That is, in order to do that, in order for the Caesar to maintain power, he has to, in a way, he has to decentralize anyway. He has to get rid of all of these people who are bone deep in opposition to him, and they're all net negative for society. If the Ford Foundation imploded tomorrow, we'd all be hugely better off. And Henry Ford would be, tap dancing in hell or heaven or wherever he is. So, you can have both things. You can end the ascent of the managers to the extent that they're as broadly applied and everywhere and as parasitical as they are, and still maintain a fairly centralized and highly competent government.
Yeah, I think that once you lose that incentive, especially for that globalized kind of congealing of the managerial class, I think that a lot of that does, like you say, fall away when you no longer have these giant organizations dedicated only to feeding these people, the patrons. Then I think a lot of that does kind of disappear on its own, even if you do have a stronger government in the interim. So one thing I wanted to get into a little bit was when you were talking about AA's book, Parvini's book, you mentioned that you did not agree with his understanding of the circulation of elites, what would be necessary. Could you go a little bit into, you don't think there's a counter elite, or you didn't think there was?
Right. No,
Yeah.
I think his claim seemed to be following on Burnham's claim, though he certainly expanded upon it, that in order for a regime to lose power, a counter elite has to take power. And that's both logically and historically false. That is, much more common, a counter elite emerges after a fracture rather than a counter elite existing and then taking power from the existing elite. The best recent example of this, which I touched on very briefly earlier, is the fall of Eastern European, outside the Soviet Union, communism in 1989. People always talk about the dissidents and so on. The dissidents had nothing whatsoever to do with the fall of communism. What happened is that one day, normal people decided to go out into the streets and protest in all these different countries in different ways. There's subtle differences and larger differences, and the regime just couldn't hack it and fell apart. And sometimes there was violence involved, like Romania and other places. There was less violence involved, but there was no counter elite. I mean, there's this mythology that a lot of people have put together after the fact, saying that the dissidents in Eastern Europe who circulated samizdat and so on had anything to do with it. And there was a little bit of that in Poland with Solidarity. The Solidarity was a form of counter elite, but for the most part, what happens in real life, and you can go back to like ancient Rome for this, or any number of historical examples, when a regime fractures because of it's fragile and stupid and at its end, in the nature of things, a counter elite rises immediately, and that counter elite, frequently there's multiple counter elites which struggle with each other. I mean, Lenin is an example of that, and frequently those counter elites contain elements of the former elites who are looking out for the main chance and looking for new opportunities. You don't get a complete separation of old and new. You get a lot of people who are, to put it plainly, entirely opportunistic. They're like, yesterday I liked this other, I was all left wing, and today I'm all right wing. This famously happened in Germany in the 1930s. It was remarked upon by multiple Western travelers that a huge amounts of young people in particular, but also grown-ups, young adults and fully fledged middle-aged adults who were communist, the next day decided they were going to be National Socialist, because why not? And so people will change their tune very rapidly in a fracture type situation, thereby creating a new counter elite. So when people, you frequently see, and I think people use this, to your earlier point, as an excuse for passivism, or saying, well, there's nothing we can do and the regime's going to last forever and it's just terrible. We don't see a counter elite, except, it's us. And since we're the only possible counter elite, and we're certainly not going to threaten the government directly because we don't want to end up in Guantanamo Bay, or like the electoral justice protest martyrs, we don't want to end up like them, so we'll do nothing. And since we're doing nothing, nobody can do anything, and nothing will ever happen. And that's just not a logical chain that works.
So one of the things that you also talked about was the interplay between what the elite want and what the people want. Now, this is something I try to touch on some, because I think it's a little more complicated when people just try to say, well, the people listen to whatever the rulers say and the rulers completely dictate. I think there's a more organic interplay between the elite and the people, and kind of who's leading who and where. Would you say that, culture is just downstream from power? Is there a give and take? How does that work? Will Caesar have the kind of the mentality and the well-being of the people in mind right away, or will he shape that? What will that look like?
Definitely, power is not downstream of culture. Culture is more downstream of power, but it is a two-way street, as you suggest. And I overuse this quotation, but I always quote Jose Ortega y Gasset, who is an early 20th century Spanish philosopher who wrote The Revolt of the Masses. But one of his phrases is, force follows public opinion. So it's essentially impossible to be a Caesar or be anybody who is trying to take over and form a new polity, reconstruct a society, without having both the interests of the masses in mind and adequate support from the masses. You can't push uphill all the time. And you see the communists tried to push uphill all the time, and they only were able to last 40 years in most cases, a little bit longer in the case of the Soviet Union, and so on. And there were plenty of reasons why they should have collapsed earlier. So if you don't keep the interests of the people in mind, it's a very difficult task to rule. And it's even more difficult task to reconstruct the society, in the sense of create a new governance system and a new set of things that relate to governance, whether that's social welfare or human flourishing or your space program, if people aren't behind it. But paradoxically, I think this is actually a somewhat easier, or will be a somewhat easier task than it seems. First of all, to the extent that Caesar depoliticizes everything, and people are no longer able to, or for that matter, allowed to, get their value, their meaning in life from politics, people tend to have many of the same basic concerns and interests. They want a job, they want to have their family to be safe, they want food, they want reasonable opportunities, they want reasonable entertainment, they want the nation to be something they can be proud of, they want their culture to be strong. So a Caesar who simply recognizes basic human nature and cuts off politicization is going to be pretty far along the way to getting the goodwill of the people. Of course, to do that, you have to entirely crush all left ideology. That is, you have to, and that involves forbidding legally, but more important, forbidding socially, the people who are left-wing ideologues from opening their mouths and poisoning the body politic. They can't be allowed in the body politic, which hopefully in a fracture the left will have discredited itself. But the nature of the left is a snake. It's always going to crawl back, like it did in the Garden of Eden with the serpent, and try to lure people back to the promises the left makes, which are very seductive. So until you break that entirely and depoliticize the society, it's hard for Caesar to give the people continuously what they want, because you'll have that set of malcontents, for lack of a better term. I do think that that Caesar has to pay attention to what the masses think as well. This is not just dictated, but what the masses want is those things identified. And so, to the extent I guess my point is that we're used to people thinking that they want, when we ask what do the people want, we try to give a political answer. And what will happen, hopefully, in this new society is that people will not give a political answer. They will give a non-political answer, and that's a much easier thing to satisfy, and something that's easier to set up a virtuous feedback cycle to accomplish.
Yeah, I think you can tell how desperate people were for this with Trump, because I think it's so obvious that Trump is not the guy, but just the promise of the possibility of the guy had people, they would have thrown themselves in front of, cars.
Yeah.
That's how desperate people are for that kind of solution at this point.
Yeah, people just want to lead their lives normally. I mean, this gets ridiculed on the right as the grillers. People just want to grill and so on, but there's a lot of truth in that. And I mean, the people should be able to grill. They should be able to send their children to school and just figure they're going to get an education. I mean, they should figure that criminals will be instantly dealt with. None of this stuff is new. I mean, all we have to do is look a little bit back into the past, and that it helps to have a broad vision of the past, and we can see what the future should look like, and that it's attainable. We are propagandized that these things are not attainable. They are extremely attainable.
Yeah, one of the things, one of my signs is, the side that wants to win always beats the side that wants to be left alone. And some people misinterpret that. They think that means I think everyone should be obsessed with politics all the time. And no, that's not what I mean at all. What I mean is that you have to care enough to establish an order where you don't have to care anymore.
Yes, absolutely. Good way to put it.
And so that's really essential. And I think more and more people on the right are starting to understand. There's still a lot of, we're still getting National Review articles about the dangers of the, I know.
I mean, but nowadays we just laugh contemptuously. Like a couple of years ago, people would have talked about why National Review was like a bunch of clowns. Now, people it's just dismissive. And yeah, there are some people who read National Review. I guess I don't know any, but I mean, it's just not important.
Yeah, its main purpose is being quote tweeted in the middle of a dunk. That's pretty much what the National Review exists to do at this point. So one thing that you touched on just briefly at the beginning, but I wanted to get into a little more when you're talking about your optimism. So post Caesar, or in the middle of Caesar, whatever. What are some of the things that we could look forward to? One thing I think that you really want to think about is like, we would need a unification of culture in some way, right? Because you can't govern for the good of a people if you don't have a people, right? If you don't have an identity and an understanding. I know we're all speculating here, so I'm not holding you to any predictions here. Don't worry, I won't be back in 5 years like, well, you didn't exactly lay it out perfectly. But what might that look like? What might the unification of a culture look like, and what would that allow Americans to build? What would be some of those positive, optimistic outcomes that we could think about?
I think there's almost no chance of America as a contiguous nation surviving this process. And part of the reason for that is that the country is simply too diverse, and diversity is not our strength. So even any logical, geographic, or cultural subset of the country contains an enormous amount of diversity relative to the early years of America, which were very successful. But that's just the way it is. I mean, we're going to have to deal with the way that what we have in terms of having lots of different types of people, races, cultures, religions in any given area that's being ruled. And the only way you can do that historically, even remotely adequately, is with the way the Ottomans did it with the millet system, where in essence you have a lot of cultural entities that have self-governance. So some things will solve themselves because the left will not be allowed. And anyway, the left doesn't have children. But you can imagine, for example, as the Amish and the Mormons grow, the Amish and the Mormons take over. They have what are largely self-governing communities that are within the ambit of a broader government. And I say national government, but I don't really mean like national United States. I mean like something that's a fifth or a tenth or a third of the former United States. So you could set up, as long as you've decentralized most of government and you've made the government no longer responsible for many of the things government is responsible for now. And I don't mean this as some kind of libertarian fantasy, but you can still imagine a system that would work if those people had felt that they had enough in common with the national government as well as with the fellow citizens within their own millet, that is kind of cultural grouping. And this kind of thing used to be more common in America as well. Before the age of technology and easy travel, obviously people had within a state, but certainly within a country, you had hugely divergent cultural groupings that were largely self-governing, and you see it now. Yeah, you see it like the Hasidim in New York, and you have the Mormons, obviously, and the Amish certainly. So this kind of system could work for a government. Combining it with a strong national government that does things like space exploration might be a bit of a challenge, but hey, all we can do is try.
So, if we're looking at this future, the thing that everyone wants, and it's always the hardest question, it's always the hardest one for me to answer as well. What do we do now, right? Like, what can I be doing? What should I be doing with this kind of future on the horizon? What kind of advice would you give to maybe a young person looking at something like the possibility of college? And what kind of advice would you give to someone who's further down the road with a family and the standard issue mortgage?
Well, this is a long, complicated topic. I, in fact, wrote a very long piece about advice to the young a couple of weeks ago. And it's also something I talked at some length with Carlson about. But I think the short answer for the young is that you want to acquire a skill set that offers you flexibility and resilience. So at the extreme of stupidity, you don't want to get a gender studies degree, because in the future, a gender studies degree will be worth less than nothing. It will mark you as an enemy of the people, as it should. And so don't do that. That doesn't mean you have to go off and become a Mason. Being a Mason is not for everybody. I do think people should very seriously consider manual work. It may mean that you should do something that's more useful, like medicine, but that's its own set of problems. But you should focus on doing something that fits with your talents and interests, that gives you future flexibility and doesn't lock you into either something stupid like a gender studies degree, but more generally doesn't lock you into a professional managerial elite career. Many years ago, I was a mergers and acquisitions lawyer, and don't do that. I mean, I enjoyed it, but that was 20 years ago, and those opportunities aren't available. So not resilient, being a lawyer. Being a doctor, resilient. Being a Mason, resilient. Being a guy who works at a paper pushing job because that's all you can, all the only job you can find, but also spend some time learning how to do small scale farming or gardening. That's also resilient. You can separate your career and your other interests. I keep bees, for example. It's got like 100 pounds of honey this year, so I guess I know what I'll be eating this winter. So and then for older people, and for people in general, just not focusing on age necessarily, this is the question of the day, right? Because there's no way to accelerate this process. And historically, people who have done that, what the Russians used to call propaganda of the deed, are just a bunch of clowns. I mean, there's no upside in that kind of stuff. I mean, and in fact, it helps the regime because it allows that's why the regime, in their kind of fear-soaked way, puffs up the electoral justice protest of January 6th because they think it benefits them in their power. I'm not sure that's actually true, but be that as it may, that's why they do it. So I think that everyone needs to in some ways, the answer is the same as with the young. You need to be developing resilience for potential hard times ahead. You don't want to, get in shape. I mean, these are all kind of obvious things that people talk about all the time. They're not new to me. I mean, you can go the sun and steel route, or you could just not eat so much damn Doritos, and get out, exercise. I mean, build your garden, have some chickens, whatever. This is all kind of a waiting game. And you remember that Dr. Seuss book, The Places You'll Go, which we read to children, and there's a thing in there that, well, you'll go all these places except if you end up in the waiting place, which is like this useless place where nothing ever happens and you're just waiting for something to happen. Well, that's kind of where we are. We are in the waiting place. But I maintain, because it's cost-free for me, I guess, that we're not going to have to wait long. And I'll be angry if I'm 85 years old and have a long gray Moses beard and I don't know, Chelsea Clinton is president and everything's just crappy. So I sure hope that's not my future.
They're still debating over whether you can trans 4-year-olds. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's not, I just don't believe that's going to keep on.
Yeah. Well, I think we hit most of what I want to talk about there. Guys, got a few super chats, so we'll hit those in just a second. Did we get to everything you wanted to cover? Anything you wanted to touch
yeah, this is awesome. I mean,
okay.
I'm pleased to be invited on the show, and I I love talking about this stuff. I love Q&A, so I can't actually see the questions because I'm an
Oh, sure. Don't worry. I'll put them up here when we.
But I can love I love Q&A. I was doing a thing up private event at a college a couple of weeks ago, just for some PhD students, just for giggles, and it got on for like 2.5 hours. And someone leaned over to my wife who was there and said, "Do we need to cut this off?" He's like, "No, he can do this all night long." So we can do Q&A all night long.
Excellent. All right, we've got Skeptical Panda here for $5. May not have gotten that at your university, but around here you can get Skeptical Panda. And he says, "Hi, Auron. Saw your post mentioning you were suspended from Twitter. Seems censorship everywhere is tightening. Must be another U.S. election season." Yeah, I had just said you shouldn't be able to trans 2-year-olds, and apparently you can't say that on Twitter anymore. That's the great thing about the terms of service, guys. They mean whatever they want them to mean, whenever they want them to mean them. So yeah, I mean, as kind of the attention gets more, I mean, it's only a matter of time. Follow on other platforms. Don't just think Twitter's going to be there forever. It's all of us will get pushed off of all that stuff.
I will say on Twitter, I maintain as a former M&A lawyer that Elon Musk will in fact buy Twitter.
You think so?
Yes, I think I regard these various legal machinations as primarily a price negotiation device.
Do you think he'll make the kind of changes people are hoping for? I mean, Musk obviously has made a lot of noise about freedom of speech, but it seems like he also, he's wanted to push to end anons and
yes,
other things.
Yes is the short answer to the question, though I have maintained for some time, but I think he also realizes this, that Musk will have to break the regime or the regime will break Musk. But I don't think he's going to, play nice if he gets if he does buy Twitter simply in an attempt to placate the regime.
It's interesting because I don't know that I see him as much of a threat to the regime as you do. I think he makes the right noises, but I think at the end of the day, it feels like he relies on it pretty heavily. I mean, obviously you travel in those waters far more than I do, so you might be more familiar. But to me, to me, it feels like, again, I guess ideology being our guide, it feels like he's not as ideologically opposed to the regime as many, but maybe that's not what's necessary.
Well, to my point earlier, yes, I think Elon Musk is certainly less political, less ideological, but Musk is that type of guy who wants certain things, and he is driven by an internal spring, and the regime stands in the way of those things. And they're not ideologies; they're personalized to him.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, I think that's true. That's true. But yeah, to get back on the Twitter thing, I think there was mass reporting or something. I'm pretty careful with my language on Twitter, and out of necessity. So I was surprised that even that got hit. But
are you going to get on? Is it like I don't know how these things work.
It was just a delete. It was just you have to delete these. You have to acknowledge that they violated this policy that we're not going to explain. It really is the most amazingly Orwellian type thing. Like, we need you to publicly go through the demoralizing step of deleting this thing that obviously you violate a policy that we can't actually define or announce.
Well, there is, as they say, no political solution.
Yeah. Skeptical Panda here again. $2. Thank you very much. Great discussion, Auron Charles. Thank you very much, sir. All right, guys. I think that was about it this time. If anyone has another question, I'll give you a second to get it in. But Charles, can you tell people where they can find all the stuff they're doing? I know you mentioned a little bit at the beginning.
Sure. But my main site, which I revolve everything around, is The Worthy House, theworthyhouse.com. I cross-post on Twitter and so on, but I'm not a hot takes on Twitter guy for the most part. And I do, however, offer all of my stuff in written form and audio form, narration, podcast form, on podcast platforms, as well as on YouTube with carefully done subtitles, because there's some set of people who actually enjoy reading the subtitles on YouTube. So in the auto-generated subtitles are very frustrating. So surprisingly, people listen to the audio more than they do the written version. So there you go. It's available in all kinds of formats.
Yeah, I do the same, and it was funny. I always assumed people would rather listen to my stuff than read it, and then it ended up being the other way around. But Yeah, but either way, that is very handy. I was definitely listening to yours as I was getting work done in the yard here, so very handy. Appreciate that. Let's see, we have a few more that came in here real quick.
Come on, people, let's do Q&A.
There we go. Uh, Helig Usvart, I think is the best way to pronounce that, for $30. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that, guys. By the way, ADL has partnered openly with PayPal to retcon, strategically target the likes of people watching the stream. Consider that legal avenues may avail for totally decoupling from PayPal. Revolver Mag did a piece on it. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we know that there are a number of organizations, ADL included, which specifically try to get people canceled, make sure that they can't take in payments. I think the big one that people were talking about was that Gays Against Groomers organization, and there was another one that recently PayPal banned them, and they get banned for everything else. This is obviously a huge problem. I know there's a number of people who have things in the works. I know Gab has its own payment processing that I think it's got up and running, and then there are other organizations that are working on similar thing. Actually, Charles, you'd be a great person to talk about this. What do you think about these parallel financial institutions and other institutions like that? I think kind of showing its obvious need, but do you think that's stuff that's going to get off the ground? Do you think it's going to be allowed? Are those
Yeah,
crack down on this stuff?
I'm actually fascinated with this stuff. I'm actually somewhat less fascinated with it than I used to be a couple of years ago, because it became evident after the Parler debacle that the only thing that works is force. And there's no universe. Parallel institutions simply won't be allowed. And I'm aware generally that Gab has some payment processing, but soon you'll have indictments for money laundering or what have you. The I don't know if you saw, there was some the terrorist Department of Justice did an FBI raid on a pro-life guy who had been charged for a federal crime for simple assault over a year ago. That is, he was just charged now for something he allegedly did a year ago, and they sent like 30 armed FBI agents to his suburban home with all his kids and so on. In this atmosphere, these things simply won't be permitted. And so I applaud and admire people who try to set alternate payment structures up and so on. And you also see this in the reaction to the Ukraine war. Let me leave aside the substance of the Ukraine war. The government just feels free to confiscate assets and what have you. So, I mean, the next trick would be to confiscate the assets of people like you and me because they say so. So you can work hard on these things like Parler did, and they can just take them away instantaneously. I support certainly the legislative work that Texas has been doing. There's various court and legislative things that people do, but at the end of the day, you can't rely on it, and that's why I focus primarily on my own site as the central thing, and I try to drive people there to subscribe for free. That is, I get their names so I can push out notifications of new stuff, simply because you never know when something like YouTube or what have you will disappear. So I admire the people who do that kind of work. I think it's as the gyre tightens or widens or whatever the Yeats metaphor is, it's going to get harder and harder for those things to not be crushed. On the other hand, the faster those things happen, the closer we are to the fracture. So there you go.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that's weird about going through this is like after like the 10th revolution of this particular cycle is you can see around the corners in some ways, but you can't avoid them, right? Like you still have to go through the history. You don't just get to skip to the end. And so I think it is really important for people to build those things, even if they are, like you said, eventually going to have, the regime will come from, because people make this point all the time. They're like, why bother building this stuff? They'll come for that too. And it's like, yes, they will, but you're buying time for yourself, and time is all you have at this point. And also, every time the regime has to do that, every time they have to flex on people in that way, the power is more brittle, right? It's more obvious, it's more 100%. Brittle. And so make them do it. Even if they're gonna do it, make them do it. Like, make them show themselves. This is the value of that stuff.
The one thing we should do is record the names of anyone involved in any of these things.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Absolutely true. Well, and that's also, like you're saying, that's one thing I like about Substack is it gives you you get the email addresses, you have the contact information of everyone who's joined on. So make sure you're joining those other platforms, because you can, like you said, whether it's the direct website or the mailing lists and stuff, it allows you to work around that stuff even as it comes apart here.
Definitely.
We see. We got a young guy here for $50. Thank you very much. Very generous of you.
Ooh.
Really appreciate it, sir. When the Soviet Union fell, wasn't America and the West more broadly the counter elite? We don't have a foreign counter elite now. Second question: since I'm about to start studying computer science at university, worth it for the future?
Excellent question. So I would say on the first one, that is a common myth that the fall of communism was done or initiated or impelled by reference to the West. You know, blue jeans, rock music, Western competence. This is Yarvin is always pushing this. This is totally false, and I'm half Hungarian, so I should know. And so what was driven by, and Ryszard Legutko wrote a Polish legislator wrote a book a couple of years ago called "The Demon in Democracy," which talks about this. It's a short book, and it's the best explanation of this. The people got tired of communism not because they wanted blue jeans and the access to the Western counter elite and more consumer goods. They ignored because they wanted freedom in the sense that we have it now. Freedom to take more fentanyl, freedom to engage in various weird sexual practices, whatever. What they wanted is a return to the traditions of their nation, largely religious, heavy religious component. And that's it. This idea that the West, the beacon of the West, had something to do with it is just a self-congratulatory myth perpetuated at the time and even more since. And what they really wanted to do is like have Angela Merkel be their lodestar. I mean, it's just silly if you think about it. So no, the answer is no. No. And the second question on computer science was yes, I think that is definitely worth it. Because I think technology, I think there's many problems with technology. Like I don't think Caesar should allow Tinder, for example. But I think there's many things that Caesar should simply forbid. And people have gotten out of they're like, well, you can't do that. I mean, of course you can do that. You can.
Yes, you can.
I mean, you can do whatever you want.
Absolutely can.
So, but technology is the future. Technology isn't going away. At least I hope it's not. I mean, this idea that we're all going to go back to some Bronze Age agrarian future or the mid-19th century steam engines. Yeah, I mean, there's scenarios in which that might happen, like nuclear war or what have you. But short of that, computer science is a valuable set of skills that can give you resilience in the future. And you may be programming Tinder, but hopefully you'll be programming Caesar's Mars probes. That's not actually an Elon Musk reference, but maybe there's an opportunity there. But yes, I would say yes to computer science.
One other thing that you kind of touched on for a second there that I wanted to ask you and I forgot earlier. What do you think about religion as part of this? A lot of debates about, obviously, the progressivism is a religion, wokeism is a religion. I think that's kind of been covered to death at this point. But when Caesar comes, or when the next regime comes, and you have this shift, do you think that religion will play a role, or do you think you'll see a return to maybe a Christianity, or does it have to be something new? A lot of people say no, Christianity is dead, people will never return to it. Other people saying people will never return to like our current conception of religion, and they'll need something different to kind of give that unification. And that what do you think about the future of?
I think in no particular order that it will definitely have a religious revival component, because that's just the way human nature works. And Caesar himself will probably be a sociopath who mouths the right things and has no real religious beliefs of his own, except for where's my power coming from and how can I avoid losing that power? There are exceptions to that occasionally, but for the most part, someone who fits the bill of a Caesar isn't going to be religious in any meaningful way. But there definitely will be a very strong religious revival component, if for no other reason than that binds the people together and is necessary for the people to act enough in unison to move on to the next stage in society, as well as religion is a big part of social compulsion and stigma. And the new society should have I would say roughly 962 times more stigma than we have in today's society. I mean, stigma should be everywhere. Everything you do should be stigmatized by the people around you if it doesn't fit with that's the way a strong society is run. And religion is necessarily a strong component of that, because without a religious sanction, it's just like, I don't like that thing you're doing. Well, okay, so what? So religion is necessarily part of that. Christianity, I favor Christianity, but my favoring has nothing to do with it. I think that Christianity is completely false, that Christianity is been proven inadequate or is desiccated. I mean, certainly many modern variations of Christianity are already disappearing and will totally disappear. But the skeleton of Christianity, particularly things like Eastern Orthodoxy, are certainly leading contenders for the future. Could be could be the Mormons. Could be it would not be Islam in the West. You could have a new religion. I can't rule that out. Historically, seems unlikely, but these things always seem unlikely until they're there. So, but whatever it is, there will 100% be a very strong religious component in the future society.
Gotcha. Here we've got the Laureist for £5. Thank you. Don't encourage people to do real jobs. I'm loving the lack of competition. Kidding. Thanks for the stream. Yeah, guys. Let me tell you, the ability to build and maintain infrastructure probably going to be super handy right now. So if you're in any way involved in the creation, design, building, or maintenance of infrastructure, probably a great way to plug in some job security there.
Yeah, I know. I follow a guy called Autonomous Trucker. He has a Substack and he's on Twitter too. But he's an actual truck driver, and he has a lot of really interesting things to say along those lines and some other stuff. He's also Canadian by birth, so he has lots of stuff to say about Canada.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, 100%. Speaking of getting your bank account stolen, there. Let's see. I love every time now that Justin Trudeau lectures like Iran on human rights. Like, how could you treat your protesters this way?
All right. Well, I mean, Justin Trudeau should be, removed to like Saskatchewan to pick sugar beets. He should have to go out every day and get a quota of sugar beets, and he should stay off the internet, and then he can rehabilitate himself and re-enter society.
Yeah, about 15 years of carrying buckets of water up and down a hill should be sufficient. Yeah. All right. I mean, it'll ruin the hair, but he'll learn some important lessons.
No hair gel.
All right. So the optimistic pessimist for $9.99. Does Charles believe Caesar will be a rugged fellow?
Not necessarily. I mean, the original Caesar, of course, had epilepsy and was not infrequently accused of being effete. I mean, he was rugged in the sense that he was personally brave and so on. But I don't think he'll be necessarily rugged in the sense of able to crush rocks with his hands or something like that. Famously, the original Caesar, and you shouldn't rely too much on these historical examples as definite indications of the future, but he was a upper class guy beloved by the lower class people, and that's the most likely scenario. You're unlikely to get a chud kind of Caesar for a variety of reasons. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, whether you believe that the elites are the essential driving force, there's certainly the some form of elite that picks it up. Usually at the once the whole circulation is done. So
yes.
Let's see here. Jake for $5. What is the likelihood of that Caesar will be a non-British original American ethnicity? What is the likelihood that we'll have a not legacy American Caesar?
Good question. Especially, for the whole country, it's hard to say, but I don't think it's going to be a Caesar for the whole country. So, assuming it was saying, in essence, what we're talking about are multiple Caesars, right? Because if the United States breaks up, so you could easily see a Latino Caesar in areas that are heavily Latino, and Latino Caesars in South America have, or wannabe Caesars are certainly thick on the ground. Most of them want to be rather than successful, but nonetheless, you could definitely see that. I think that it's really impossible to say. I think the fact is, though, that the majority of people in America as a whole are still white, not necessarily all British ancestry, and are probably less likely to accept a non-white Caesar. So my guess is that in most successor Caesars will be white of some sort, and to the extent you can imagine because people do tend to divide on ethnic and cultural grounds. Back to the millet system, you can imagine a white Caesar with large amounts of self-governance for certain groups based upon their ethnic background or race or whatever, however we want to cut those lines. So the answer is could be, don't know.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of there seems to be a lot of interest from the Hispanic contingent for Caesar either way. So I think that's entirely possible.
Latinos, very broadly speaking, have less of a history of so-called democratic government. And
Mhm.
as you see in the turn to Trump, I mean, this is a school of thought, which I think makes a lot of sense, that Latinos like Trump because he kicks ass and takes names.
Right.
So give a guy who's not Trump more competent, more disciplined, and you could totally see Latinos going for that guy in a big way.
Absolutely. All right, Heath here for $5. Insert witty comment. Just take my donation. Thank you very much, Heath. The thing you said was very deep, very thoughtful. Charles and I are both incredibly impressed by the complexity of your thought, and we certainly appreciate you taking the time to share that with the audience. All right, guys, I think we hit everybody. Let me double check just to make sure that I didn't leave anyone out here. And of course, I want to thank Charles for sticking around and answering all of your questions. Make sure you're checking out all of his stuff, guys. All right. So, yep, I think we got everybody. I want to thank a few people before we go who support the channel. I want to go ahead and thank Claudio Van Landingham. I want to thank Dursreg. I want to thank Easter Worshipper. Want to go ahead and thank user F1F00C09, Christopher Walsh. Want to make sure that I thank Santa because, of course, the big man supports this channel and has excellent taste. Let's see. Jonathan Anomaly. Let me make sure I got everybody here. AWXYZ. All right. I think we got no fantasy. All right, guys. Really appreciate all you guys. Rainier Boggle, once again, thank you very much. All right. So thank you to everybody who came by and commented. It was a great stream, a lot of interesting questions. And of course, thank you to Charles Haywood for stopping by. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Great to be here.
All right, guys. As always, I'll talk to you next time.